Natalia, thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm very glad. Great overview, dear colleagues, dear participants. I'm really honored and delighted to be in such a great company. I attended several lectures of this cycle, and as I have already told you, Natalia, I hope that this would be just the first stage of your project that is dedicated to a very relevant, actually, not only theoretically, but also practically topic, and I'm going to talk about the representation of evil in Ukrainian cinema of the 90s. Frankly speaking, my talk is aimed neither at searching for the universal or the most promising definition of the notion of evil, nor at evaluating different philosophical theories of evil. Instead, I must admit that my goal is quite modest yet enlightening. I would like to present Ukrainian cinema of the 90s, which is basically my scholarly interest, to show how during this very significant liminal period in Ukrainian history, narratives about Ukrainian collective traumas, particularly from the Soviet totalitarian era, that is to say from the 20th century, were constructed within the symbolic space of Ukrainian cinema. The USSR, the evil empire, as maybe you know this definition suggested sharply by Ronald Reagan, defined it with these words. It provided the genocidal policy towards Ukrainians that brought a lot of grief and led to millions of victims among the Ukrainians. The number of these losses was silenced, but not only by the occupiers, but also often by Ukrainians themselves, because of the fear of repressions, because of the fear of physical elimination, and the process of constructing this collective trauma, this exit of silence. This term was actually suggested by Agnieszka Matusiak, a Polish scholar. This process of constructing trauma started in the post-Soviet era, when the evil of the Soviet totalitarian system began to be reflected, and it was reflected surely in Ukrainian art. Therefore, the subject of my talk is the representation of evil in Ukrainian cinema of the 90s and filmic strategies of resistance, resisting evil. In my talk, I will refer to 6 films. These would be 6 examples that represent the whole period of the 90s of Ukrainian cinema. And these films, they highlight 3 ways of artistic portrayal of evil and 3 different strategies of its confrontation. The methodological foundation of my exploration is a narrative post-metaphysical approach by a philosopher, Mariia that is outlined in her book, Narrating Evil. According to Lara, evil is not an essence, but a construct. Stories are important tools for encoding evil and human violence, shaping cultural memory and fostering, in Habermas terms, learning from catastrophes. Lara states that good stories are the result of reflective judgments that can become the chosen means to rebuild communities and envision a different sense of justice. A good story that sheds light on dark episodes of the past is surely the best way to share views that can transform a community, according to Lara. In this way, creating and sharing stories that creatively frame the collective experience, the collective past, and for sure also evil, which is the subject of our interest, becomes a collective exercise of comprehension of the normative gaps, opening up possibilities for moral progress to humankind. So, what did Ukrainian directors of the 90s consider as evil? Primarily, it was the horror of the totalitarian Soviet system, which dehumanized people, destroyed their freedom, humanistic values, and Ukrainians themselves for their resistance and nonconformity. This situation of total unfreedom is seen as a source of a cycle of violence that seems to have no chance of being overcome. Not long before the collapse of the USSR, that means in early 90s, during and late 80s, during the seeming liberalization of the perestroika era, Ukrainian directors were at that time able to openly express their view of the USSR as a total prison, the zone, even with oases of inner freedom. In this context, an illustrative example, to my mind, of representing totalitarian evil that had yet to collapse, even though it was hard to believe at that time that it could happen soon, is Yuri Ilyenko's film Swan Lake, The Zone, created in 1990. The film script was written by Serhiy Parajanov, a prominent Armenian and Ukrainian director who is also known to be the founder of the Ukrainian poetic cinema, a bright phenomenon of the 1960s. And Serhiy Parajanov himself, he spent 5 years in Soviet maximum security penal colony, so he was repressed at Soviet times. His memories of his imprisonment formed the basis of Ilyenko's film script. The film's main character escapes from a Soviet prison and hides from persecution inside a giant sculpture of the sickle and hammer, as you can see here in this picture. So this giant sculpture becomes a place where this man, we do not know his name, he hides himself, hoping to be liberated from the zone after his escape from prison. We don't learn the man's name or the names of any other characters in this film. They also almost say nothing. The man fails to hide for a long time. He is found and returned to prison. He will not leave from there. After the first unsuccessful attempt of suicide, he eventually cuts his wrist, and this is the final scene of the film when we see this man without any movement, and we do not see any changes in the environment where he was. His death does not change the lives of the prisoners. According to Ukrainian film scholar Larisa Bryukhovecka, the film Swan Lake Zone fixed apocalyptic pictures of land mutilated by people and life which has already been beyond good and evil. Even though there is a hope in this film, but it lasts not for so long. The hope is also in a dead end. The hope is associated with love that this main character experiences during his escape. But I have already said that his escape was not also, the duration of his escape was not long. It was quite a short moment. And this hope, this love, also did not bring freedom to the main character. The hope also becomes buried in the sculpture of the sickle and hammer. At the same time, the very opportunity to create such a film, so the film itself as a phenomenon that appeared in early 90s, it strengthens the hope that this evil could be overcome in real life. To sustain the self-replication of this evil system, Ukrainians were often made accomplices of Soviet crimes. This is the focus of the film Wedding with Death, created in 1992 by Ukrainian director Mykola Mashchenko. The film depicts the tragedy of Stalinist repressions in the 1930s and shows the moral decline of young Ukrainian Lieutenant Sherbakov. He could have become a victim of the terror himself, but he chose to join the Soviet repressive machine. So he became the member of the system, the representative of the system. This decision spares him from the death penalty. By making a moral choice for the Soviet punitive system, the lieutenant shifts from being a national enemy to a murderer of thousands of other supposed enemies. Much of the film focuses on the second stage of his personal transformation, from deciding to collaborate with the repressive system to the mass murder of innocent people, which Sherbakov carries out quite easily and without hesitation after gaining this experience. We see that at the end of the film, talking to his colleague who expresses his fear of killing other people who are innocent, Lieutenant Sherbakov admits that everything is easy to overcome. So these limits in your consciousness that this colleague has because of being unexperienced, Lieutenant Sherbakov doesn't demonstrate hesitation at the end of the plot. The culmination of the story is the mass execution of brides and their wedding guests. You can see them in this picture. They accidentally witness another mass shooting that happens in the forest while they are celebrating their wedding. The evil's triumph here lies in the fact that both victims and perpetrators are members of the same nation, which is divided by violent and inhumane Soviet system. So actually, they all are the representatives of the same society. However, there is a great gap between them that results in a great collective trauma. However, many of the criminals shared the tragic fate of their victims. We know that from the history. Sometimes they really survived longer because they valued their life more than the universal values. Quite paradoxically, beyond the evil empire, some Ukrainian directors of the 90s see the moral decline of Ukrainian society after the USSR's collapse as a source of evil and violence. So the source for evil and violence lies not only in external space, is not associated only with the repressive machine and totalitarian Soviet system, but the reasons for that also may be within the Ukrainian society. For example, the most of Kira Muratova's films from the 90s demonstrate this approach. We see that the majority of her characters of films of this period, they are egoistic and they have distorted values. Muratova not only highlights the decline in public morals, but also shows how the space of freedom, which was gained, which was struggled for by generations of Ukrainians, and that they already get in the 90s, this space for freedom and hope, it diminishes in the 90s together with social integrity, and this causes strong resentment. For instance, such aggressive resentment is a central theme in her short film A Letter to America, which was filmed in 1999. The main character of this film, Oleg, records a video letter to his ex-girlfriend, who we know lives in the US. She emigrated from the USSR, or maybe right after its collapse, and Oleg records the message to his ex-girlfriend. In his letter, he sounds very aggressive. He's proud of his poverty, laziness. He's proud of the lies that surround him. He's proud of his humiliation because actually he doesn't work. He doesn't have money. He rents his flat. He owns a flat, but he rents this flat and he doesn't receive any money for that. So he is totally poor without work, but he is somehow proud of his humiliation. At the end of the film, he recites a poem he dedicates the poem, he addresses this poem to his ex-girlfriend, where there are such words. He ends this poem with a threat. Don't try back. If you come back, we will kill you with the belt of your suitcase. So this is the message to those who left post-Soviet country that is totally diminished. So here is total crisis, but people who live here, they experience a very radical and aggressive resentment. After saying these words, he spits on the camera. That means a point in his text, and he doesn't wait for any answer from his ex-girlfriend from the US. This character of Muratova represents the drama of the lost generation of the 90s. Educated and creative people who were morally trapped during the economic crisis after the collapse of the USSR and faced vague future prospects. These individuals were poor, unable to realize their talents, and often resorted to violence. Therefore, evil, in Muratova's view, was not a genuine goal. It was not an essence. It wasn't a state of things, but it could be a result. So it was a potential result of the destructive behavior of this lost generation. Still, their crimes might have had a mitigating factor, according to Muratova. So she meant that these people were not absolutely responsible for their evil deeds, because the situation in general was a complete moral decline, and amidst the storm, it was too difficult to act morally. So there was a partial excuse for the circumstances after the collapse of the USSR. Ukrainian directors not only identified evil, but they also explored how to confront it. In my opinion, during the 90s, we see the coexistence of three approaches that could be fruitfully applied also to other thematic aspects of film too. So this deals not only with the topic of evil, but for now, I would talk about the relation of these approaches and their potential to consider evil as a thematic dimension of Ukrainian films of the 90s. These are anticolonial, postcolonial, and decolonial approaches, which became tools for Ukraine's gradual exit from silence in the post-Soviet era. These approaches represent various ways of depicting taboo or complex topics, also evil, which are related to exploring the traumatic collective experience of the 20th century. They suggest different visions about how to resist evil, how to assign guilt and responsibility for national successes and failures, how to assess liberation movements and their methods that were often cruel at different stages of our history, how to choose cultural, political, and moral examples that are worth following. Are these to be Ukrainian national examples or European or Russian Soviet and so on? My understanding of these three approaches, cinematic strategies, is based on the definitions of anti-colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial provided by Miroslav Shkandriy and Yulia Kravchenko in their article for a very fruitful project entitled Ukrainian Decolonial Glossary that I sincerely recommend you to check. These scholars define anti-colonial as something that refers to the rejection of imperial tropes expressed in resistance to degrading stereotypes. The term post-colonial is interpreted as a departure from dependence on binary oppositions like good and evil, center and periphery, and so on, which are conveyed with irony, parody, and playfulness. Evil is conquered within this strategy, even unconsciously, through reduction ad absurdum in the space of a game. Finally, the term decolonial, this is the last strategy I would like to introduce, refers to the process of forming and establishing the emancipated consciousness of nation that had been enslaved in the past. The starting point is one's own history, culture, and language. Based on them, the nation can strive for cultural emancipation. Let's begin with the first strategy, which is anticolonial. This will be my fourth example. This will be the fourth film I would like to talk about. The strategy of anti-colonial resistance to evil is vividly depicted in films about the UPA, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, that was active in the mid-20th century. And it is a true fact that a lot of Ukrainian directors during the 90s, they referred to the topic of the UPA struggle. Exactly at the turn of the 90s, during the collapse of the communist system and immediately after Ukraine's independence was declared, Ukrainian filmmakers turned to understanding the tragic consequences of the USSR's anti-Ukrainian policies. A clear example of this strategy, not only this film, but I will talk about just one of them, is a film by Grigory Kokhan, executed Sunrises. The film addresses the fight of UPA for Ukrainian independence after the Soviet occupation of Western Ukraine. Soviet authorities terrorized locals for supporting partisans, so the members of this UPA movement, and they organize a deportation of Ukrainians to Siberia, unloyal Ukrainians who still support these national liberation movements. The UPA members eventually, in the film, expose a meeting of Soviet officers, and we see that they shoot them all as a revenge for killing their comrades. So the last scene of this film is a mass shooting of the representatives of the Soviet power. An evident trait of this anti-colonial strategy, I think it is evident that its reactivity and reflectivity, or we can also say mirroring, in causing evil, along with a different assessment of the moral permissibility of actions that are associated with causing evil, which we evaluate depending on the perpetrators and their goals. So we take into account the motivation of people who act violently or cruelly. If we pose a question whether a shooting can be morally justified, for sure it's a general question, but at first, the very first reaction would be that it cannot be morally justified. But within the context of representation of evil, as we are talking about Ukrainian film directors of the 90s, this abstract question becomes clear when viewed in this historical context. The goal of the armed units of the UPA was to restore an independent Ukrainian state on Ukrainian lands. The struggle involved armed conflict, for sure, against the Soviet government, Nazi occupiers, and other forces that were against Ukrainian independence. Moreover, UPA protected the Ukrainian population from repression. Underground UPA units, outnumbered by Soviet troops, it is also a fact that the number of members of UPA, they were fewer than Soviet troops. They operated from 1942 until the mid-50s. In the USSR, membership in the UPA was stigmatized, and the memory of this resistance was suppressed for decades. Therefore, Ukrainian filmmakers of the 90s aimed to restore historical justice and reaffirm Ukrainians' role in national self-determination through their historical films. So it was not a consideration of moral permissibility of evil and claiming that this has to be a universal rule. However, it was an attempt to consider any attempts, any collective attempts, collaborative attempts of Ukrainians within the situation of unfreedom to justify their right for their state. Thus, within the framework of the anti-colonial strategy of confronting evil, evil is primarily overcome through armed resistance. So there is a very violent and cruel confrontation that is morally justified. The post-colonial strategy is vividly and ironically embodied in the film Hunt for the Cossack Gold, filmed in 1993 by Vadim Castelli. By the way, you can see the director here in this picture during the filming process. The film deconstructs the myth about the treasures of the Ukrainian hetman Pavlo Polubotok, which was revived in Ukraine in 1990s. Polubotok is actually a real historical figure of the 17th century, the head of the Ukrainian Cossack state who was arrested by the Russian emperor, and he died in exile in early 18th century in 1724. But the myth, the legend, it deals with the story of treasures of this hetman, the head of the Ukrainian state, that were hidden by the decision of Polubotok in England. Before being arrested, Polubotok transferred, this is a legend, his treasures to an English bank as a legacy, or we can say as a heritage, to the future independent Ukrainian state. The image of Polubotok's treasures in the film is metaphorical. We do not see these treasures. The treasures are actually the very idea of Ukrainian independence, which has been threatened for centuries. According to the film's plot, in the 90s, so the action is in the 90s. The film deals with the situation of this liminal 90s, post-Soviet times. Russian imperialists, Soviet spies, British bankers, Ukrainian bandits, all of these confronting groups, they are hunting for this treasure. They want to have it. They want to possess it. Fragile, like the future of the Ukrainian state, the fate of this national treasure depends on an ordinary Ukrainian young man, an ordinary guy called Ivan, who sells honey. So he is beyond all the political conflicts. He is not aware who he is. He is not aware that he is an ancestor of a Ukrainian hetman. So he is just an ordinary guy who wants to have some money, but he doesn't pretend to have too much. So he has no idea. Ivan is completely unaware of his mission that holds national significance. Ivan's amnesia is not accidental, because for a long time the collective memory of generations of Ukrainians was intentionally erased by the colonialists. So here we see, like with this humor, playfulness, very deep ideas are encoded. Castelli ironically challenges colonial stereotypes, particularly the Russian-imposed idea that Ukrainian culture is low and rural. Well, the main character is an ordinary guy from Kyiv region. He even doesn't live in a city. And he also dispels the myth that Ukrainian state lacks political agency. Castelli dispels this Russian myth by understanding culture anthropologically as the shared way of life of a national community that is distinctive and self-sufficient. It is no coincidence that the film shows no resentment. We saw a lot of resentment in other films that I introduced, but here there is no resentment towards this unfair depiction of Ukrainians. Although Castelli actually had reasons, we may assume that he had reasons for this resentment, because Castelli, the director himself, he was the son of Ukrainian dissident and political prisoner Heli Snigiryov, who was tortured to death in 1970s. But Castelli, the director, has abandoned this anti-colonial rebellion and literal condemnation of evil. We see that he plays with these images of evil. Castelli's attitude towards Ukrainians who in the 90s had not yet come to terms with their collective traumas is deeply ironic. For him, the greater evil is not external threat, but the irresponsibility of the Ukrainians themselves, along with their search for easy solutions. At the same time, Castelli does not doubt the moral strengths and superiority of ordinary people. However, he does this without moralizing. He doesn't say that everything has to be very easy for those who have courage, for those who strive for justice, honesty, and innocence. He uses humor and plays with colonial symbols and shows that all these virtues that I just have listed, public service also among them, should help dispel the dark shadows of the colonial past. When this happens is less important from the postcolonial perspective, and I suggest watching an episode from this film. You may suppose this is my favorite film. I really do love this film, and why I have chosen it to demonstrate it to you, because I think that beyond Ukrainian context, even with an atmosphere, you can feel this post-colonial vibe, this humor, and this distinctive synthesis of different layers of the past that appear in a very humorous way. So this is the last scene of the film when Ivan, the main character, you will identify him easily, he saves the treasures, he runs away into the sunset and tries to save the treasures from all those violent, cruel, evil groups.
Та на що вона мені?
Та почитай, що в Україні робиться, а то тобі тільки спати.
Хлопці, ви за медом? Але у мене по 3
статьей 137 прим. Идя навстречу требованиям широких слоев, мы принимаем на себя ответственность за сбережение золотого запаса СНГ. С целью защиты жизненно важных интересов граждан и недопущения ухудшения...
Как неуклонный сторонник демократии я отменяю этот приказ.
Да-да, мы отменяем.
Я очень много пережил, передумал и пришел к выводу, что мы должны сберечь золото свободной федерации обновленных ассоциаций. Да. Несите, хлопцы, бочки в мою машину.
Да, в нашу машину.
Давайте. Вот. Это главное.
Военнослужащие, земляки, остановитесь! От имени народа, избравшего меня, я отменяю все предыдущие указы. Вся власть переходит в руки народа России и его президента.
Борис Николаевич.
А для разрядки я и вас отменяю. Земляки, несите золото сюда!
Суперовий, шановні панове, на Україні все спокійно, нічого надзвичайного не запроваджено, усе підпорядковано нам. Кузьмо, неси діжки на віз.
Президенты больны. Мы их подлечим. Шагом марш!
Как бывший президент бывшего Союза не могу допустить,
Сейчас
чтобы
не
вы...
поддерживает избранного народом
З
президента.
таким ми не побудуємо незалежну державу.
Общественных туалетов и...
Україна суверенний член ООН.
А мы с вами пересмотрим кордоны. Ешьте, земляки.
Я так много пережил.
Ви заважаєте мені працювати.
Мы еще увидим, кто из ху.
Он много пережил. Іване, ти куди?
Я повернусь! Ти чекай! Я обов'язково повернусь! Ти тільки...
Іване.
stop here. I hope whether you have any knowledge of Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian language, I'm not sure, but there were subtitles that you could read and somehow they could make it easier for you to understand just a bit this mood, general mood that you hear is not sad. It has nothing to do with resentment. It is very optimistic, brave, dynamic, but still it outlines the problem, the problem, external problem, internal problem that has to be dealt with. Let's now turn to the last strategy, the decolonial perspective, that also rejects the idea of anti-colonial struggle as the focus of artists who embody the view that shifts from the center to a self-sufficient and authentic national culture. This prompts a reconsideration of participants' potential in the confrontation. In other words, within this strategy, the agents of evil, the enslavers, lose their symbolic power at all, and only Ukrainians are seen as responsible for developing a strategic vision of their national future and maintaining their own statehood. For sure, it doesn't mean that decolonial strategy has to be always somehow related to Ukrainian perspective, but it's just the frame of our talk today. To my mind, a vivid example of this perspective in Ukrainian cinema of the 90s is the film The Hetman's Regalia, filmed in 1993 by Leonid Osika. The events of the film take place in 17th century Ukraine after the death of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was the founder of the Ukrainian Cossack state. Two political forces participate in the struggle for political power after his death. On the one hand, the supporters of his son. On the other hand, the supporters of the legitimate head of this Ukrainian state. Both groups claim their right to the regalia. Regalia, you can see one of their representations here. So these are the symbol of power, political power. They are kept in the film by Hetman's daughter, who aims to preserve the state beyond all those conflicts. The regalia are the guarantee of the legitimacy of the power structure in the state and are also a subject of internal conflict. Unlike Castelli, the previous director who filmed The Hunt for Cossack Gold, Osika concentrates solely on the internal threat, national discord and the decline of the national elite, which is the greatest evil and danger to the Ukrainian state because it puts it at risk. Interestingly, both Castelli and Osika doubted the security of the revived statehood even in the 90s. In their films, the treasure in the English bank and Hetman's regalia must be securely hidden for better times that await us somewhere ahead. And here you see the place where at the end of this film, the main characters hide the treasure for these better times. Well, over the past 12 years, as Russian aggression against Ukraine has been lasting, Ukrainians have been working hard to bring closer these better times after the confrontation with the evil empire. As you can see, I'm now in Kyiv and I don't have electricity, but still I'm very glad to be here with you. I hope that soon this evil will be recognized, stopped, punished, and Ukrainian artists, along with their colleagues from other countries, will reflect on the tragic and heroic Ukrainian experience so that the phrase "never again" becomes a living foundation of our cultural memory and, what is more important, also of our daily life. thank you so much for your attention. I would be glad if you have any remarks, questions related to this topic that I would endeavor to answer, to think together about it, to take into account, maybe to improve my thesis. So thank you so much for your attention, for being here, and for sure for inviting me to take part in this great Natalia's project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariia, for the presentation. I'll just stop the recording now.